Well, Gonzalo, thank you for that lovely introduction. I feel so at home here for a number of reasons. I was first elected to the board of this great organization, FPA. I probably shouldn't admit this, in 1959, and was on the board for most of 30 years, except for my time in government. I'm a very dear friend of your wonderful chairman, and have the privilege of being on the International Advisory Board of Santander, which you should know, if you don't already, is the largest bank in the Eurozone. Twice the market capital of Deutsche Bank, for example. So it's a great success story. I'm a little intimidated, however, because I see in the audience the distinguished Consul General of Italy, the distinguished head of the Italian Cultural Institute, John Bradamus, my Oxford classmate, Enzo Viscusi, and my wife, who was my co-ambassador, and if I say something wrong, I'll hear from all those people. Italy is, we'll all agree on this, I believe, an exceptional country. Exceptional because of its natural beauty, exceptional because it is the home of, some people estimate, half of the world's great artistic and cultural patrimony. Its people have a zest for life and a creativity which is quite exceptional. And it's almost everyone's favorite place to visit. Having said that, it is also an exceptionally difficult country to govern. Giulio Andreotti, in his low moments, used to say to me, quoting Mussolini, I believe, "Non è soltanto impossibile governare l'Italia, è inutile." It's not only impossible to govern Italy, it's useless. Italy has just concluded its closest election in history, and one of its most bitter. And I'm afraid the prospect that now faces us in Italy only underlines the wisdom of this rather cynical comment about the difficulty of governing Italy. And I will try to do three things tonight. First, to describe the result of the election and what is likely to happen in the next days. Second, to give a little bit of history, because time is short, to the historical origins of this problem of governability. And third, to briefly ask what the new Italian situation means for the United States, for Europe, and for Italy itself. You had a struggle in this election between two coalitions with different visions of Italy's future, certainly different visions in foreign policy, but also to some extent different visions in terms of domestic economic and social policy. It was also, of course, a struggle between two personalities who were as different as you could imagine. You had Berlusconi, known as the Cavaliere, not a deep thinker, not an intellectual, but an incredible communicator and showman. Incredibly shrewd politically and in business terms. And just look at how he came from nothing to be the richest man in the country by far, and owned the three major private TV stations, and then become prime minister. And I should say that I was the first American ambassador to get to know this extraordinary personality. And I'll just, you'll indulge me, because I think this is revealing. I arrived in Italy as ambassador in March of 1977, and I was arranging my first official visit to Milan. And the Consul General of the United States there called me and said, "Ambassador, we have your whole trip organized, but there's one problem we have. There's someone we've never heard of named Berlusconi. He's calling us every day, insisting that you come to his private television station outside Milan in a suburb in some housing development he's got going. We've never heard of him. We've never heard of this television station. We don't think anybody listens to it. And really, we think you shouldn't do it. But before we reject his request, we wanted to consult you. Well, fortunately, I said, look, and I'm probably going to say some things that I shouldn't say. My Italian friends will forgive it. But I said, at the time, I said, look, I think RAI, the Italian state network on TV, is so politicized and so boring that if someone wants to develop some private television, he should be encouraged. I'll do it. So I went to Milan 2, which was his housing development outside of Milan, and he interviewed me personally, and I was very impressed and told Danielle, this is an amazing man. And we invited him, as I recall, a couple of times to the residence, and in my book, there's even a picture of him, along with Giulio Andreotti and Gianni Letta and other persons that you would recognize at my farewell speech after Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter in the 1980 elections. Now, on the other side, we have someone as different as you could imagine. Oh, and I should add one thing. And Mr. Berlusconi has one vision in foreign policy: to be the #1 friend of the United States, to be the #1 friend of George Bush. There's just one little inconvenience that there's somebody named Tony Blair who's maybe a little bit ahead of him. But otherwise, 100% for whatever America's doing, and 100% for Iraq. And that was perhaps, to some extent, a liability in this election, because 80% of the Italian people, judging by public opinion polls, were very much against what we have been doing, our invasion of Iraq, and Bush, of course, is very unpopular throughout Europe, including in Italy. But he wanted to say, a good friend of America, and whatever we think of George Bush and Iraq, we should recognize Italy has been a terrific ally of the United States from the Second World War to the present. And in my book, I describe how they helped win the Cold War with the deployment of the cruise missiles, and I'll get to that in a minute. But 3,000 Italian troops in Iraq, and Italians' contribution to international peacekeeping is second to none. Italians have troops in Afghanistan, in the Balkans, and throughout various difficult places in Africa, and we should be grateful for that. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you have Romano Prodi, as different as from Berlusconi as you could imagine. Il Professore, he's called. And that may be a term of endearment to some, but it's also a term of contempt for others. And being a professore myself, I don't know. But I can't be against the professore. But when some people call him the professore, they have in mind that he's less than always intelligible in what he says. Sometimes comes across as a bit befuddled and absent-minded. But everyone admits he is a deep thinker. He is a man of integrity and good faith, and a good economist. And I was fortunately the first American ambassador to get to know Romano, and I'll tell you a little story about that, which I hope will be in its way revealing. In 1978, after I'd been in Italy 1 year, Romano, who was a junior minister in the Andreotti government at the time, woke up one morning to find that Andreotti had reshuffled his government, and it was announced on the radio that Prodi was out. On the radio. He was not told personally. Well, it happened that day. I had scheduled a lunch with Romano Prodi, because I believed as ambassador one should get to know the new generation, and he was then in his 30s. And I heard this on the radio, and then suddenly the phone rings, and Prodi's on the line and says, "Ambassador, you heard?" I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Well, you know, there's no point in my having lunch with you. I mean, I'm no longer anybody. You don't want to waste your time with me." And I said, "Romano, what are you talking about?" I said, "Yeah, of course we're going to have lunch. You're a friend." And then I said to him, "And I'll make a prediction. You'll be back in government, and one day you'll be prime minister." And he said, "No, no, no." I said, "Yes, you'll see." Well, in 1986, he became prime minister, and I called him, and I said, "Do you remember what I promised you?" And he had a wonderful answer. He said, "Yes, Richard, but it took a very long time." Well, I called him last week after his new victory by a wafer-thin margin, And I reminded him, and he says, yes, but it took a very long time to have a second chance. So Romano is a friend of America, and I think we should keep that in mind. I'm not sure all of the heads of his major coalition partners are, but Romano certainly is. And he has, however, perhaps a different concept of what friendship means. He said, and this was quoted in the New York Times, he said, a country like America can have two kinds of friends. One that says that America's always right, and the other that tells America when he thinks it's wrong. And I believe America is better served by the second type of friend that tells what it thinks. So George Bush and company will have to learn to get along with that. All right, now what exactly happened in this election? It's very complicated. Since time is limited, I'm going to try to make this a bit simple and cut a few corners. But as you know, we have a bicameral system in Italy, and in the vote for the Camera, the House, the margin was 49.8% of the vote for the coalition led by Prodi, and 49.7% for the coalition led by Berlusconi. So it was 0.1% difference. Of course, Berlusconi immediately said, it's a fraud. It's all fixed. It's not fair. And of course, Prodi was able to say, well, you were in charge of this. I mean, you're in charge of the government. You're in charge of the election. So, I mean, how can you say that? If it's a fraud, you've done it. I mean, so that was it's unfortunate that to this moment, at least unless something's happened today that I don't know about, although Berlusconi resigned, as he was required to, and because the courts have confirmed the results of the election, Berlusconi has still not called Prodi to congratulate him, and he doesn't accept the legitimacy of the result, and he's actually said he'll make life as difficult as possible for the government, and says it won't last long. But anyway, 49.8, 49.7, we have some experience after Florida in 2000 of what these things mean. Maybe Berlusconi outsmarted himself a little bit because he got the electoral law changed so that whoever wins the House gets a big premium to assure that there's some governability at least in the House. And thus, even though there was this wafer-thin margin, because of this automatic bonus to the winner, Prodi's coalition has 348 seats to 281 for Berlusconi, a margin of 67, which is fairly comfortable. Now, in the Senate, it's totally different. Again, under the new electoral law, and this gets, I'm not sure I can express this complexity fully, but under the new electoral law, in the Senate, the seats are apportioned on the basis of the results in the 20 separate regions of Italy. And it's done region by region. Whoever wins in a region gets 55% of the seats that are allocated to that region. Now, thus, as a result of this strange, for an American rule, even though Berlusconi's coalition won more seats in the election to the Senato, Prodi's coalition ends up with a 2-vote margin in the Senate, 158 seats to 156, a margin of 2 votes. There are 7 senators for life that are also in the Senate, and people estimate, judging for what we know of their preferences, that they might split 5-2, perhaps 4-3 or 5-2 in favor of Prodi. But it's a very, very slim margin. Now, making governability even more difficult is, as many of you know, the situation that these are not two homogeneous political parties. I compare always Italy to Spain, and I'm always very careful in the presence of friends from both countries not to indicate that I prefer one over the other, and I love them both. Spain has one great advantage over Italy. It has the problem of the regional nationalism, the Basques and Catalans, but there are 2 main national political parties, reasonably homogeneous. They alternate in power, and they're able to take decisions. Not so in Italy. The Berlusconi coalition had 4 political parties. which quarreled considerably among themselves. And one political party, which isn't even a party, it's a national movement, which is Berlusconi's own movement, the Forza Italia, which I guess you'd translate as "Go on, Italy, go Italy." And there's the party that evolved out of the former neo-fascist party, which is now the Alleanza Nazionale. And then you have a fragment of the old Christian Democrats, the UDC, and then you have the Lega Nord, the Northern League, which led by Mr. Bossi, who favors, if not autonomy, a complete independence for Padania, the northern part of Italy, at least a good deal of autonomy, which for many Italians is unacceptable. So they fight among themselves, but that's mild compared to what we're going to have now on the center-left. The center-left consists, yes, of 9 political parties. 9 political parties, count them. And the largest is a party of former communists, known as Democrats of the Left. Now, that will shock a lot of Americans. It won't shock me. I was the first ambassador to have dialogue with Italian communists, and I'll get to this story of how I was permitted to do so by Jimmy Carter. Very wisely gave me the authority to do this, so I know these people. And I think perhaps they have a certain fondness for me because at a certain time when it was not permitted for American ambassadors to talk to Italian communists, I did so and granted them visas to come to the United States and so on. And these are people who left the Communist Party when it split into social democrats, which these people are genuinely, and hardline, true-believing, still Marxist-Leninists who think that communism is wonderful, and that they are still in the parliament. That's the second, not the second largest, but a significant part of Prodi's coalition is the Rifondazione Comunista, led by Mr. Bertinotti, and they received something over 6% of the votes for the House and over 7% for the votes in the Senate. So they have quite a few senators and members of the House. And given the narrow margin in the Senate, 2 or 3 votes, they have a veto. They can hold hostage whatever reform program Mr. Prodi wants to put forward. Then you have something called the Margherita, which I guess you'd translate daisy chain, which probably sounds like a strange name for a political party to an American, and that consists of a group of former, I don't know, a cluster of former radicals and liberals and socialists, led by Mr. Rutelli, former mayor of Rome. They're fairly, on the whole, a very moderate group, and they combined with the former communists, the Democrats of the left, have something called the Olivo, and they really are the dominant element in this coalition. But there's this Bertinotti hardline group, and Mr. Bertinotti insisted on becoming president of the House, which is a very important position. It's more than formal. It has power to influence the agenda in significant ways. So that gives him a very prominent position, which is disturbing to some people. Then you have a coalition of Greens, the environmental group, and then you have a group called the Rosa nel Pugno. I'm not sure how you would translate the rose in the fist or something like that, which consists of some very eminent people who are former radicals and socialists. And then there's the Südtirol Volkspartei, which is the small group from the Alto Adige of German-speaking Italians. And then you have the fragment of the old Christian Democrats called Popolari or UDEUR. And yes, the Italy of Values, which is led by a very famous in Italy judge named Di Pietro, who was the one who launched the Clean Hands investigations in Milan from 1990 to 1992. Well, how is Mr. Prodi, who has no party, by the way, he's a former Christian Democrat, how is he going to keep all these parties together when they have to make tough decisions on economic and foreign policy questions? That is the issue. Now, let me, you might ask, what happens now? And if I say something wrong, my two friends here from Italy will tell me so. But my information is that, number one, it's been agreed just in the last 24 hours that the Parliament, two leaders of the two houses of Parliament agree that there will be an election for the President of Italy, because we have not only the election of a new Parliament and therefore a new Prime Minister, but a new President. And the new Prime Minister cannot be appointed until there's a new President, because the existing President, Carlo Azeglio Ciampi, a man of great eminence, former head of the Bank of Italy, says that he wants this to be done by his successor. So they're accelerating the vote for the new President, and that vote is taken by these two houses together, the Senate and the House, plus representatives of the regions. Together these are called the Grand Electors. They amount to 1,010. And so someone has to get in the first votes, you have to get a two-thirds majority of that number. But if you don't get an outcome in the first three votes, it goes to a simple majority. 504, 506, whatever, of the 1,010. Now, who's going to be the next president of Italy? Well, Mr. Berlusconi said a few days ago, well, the election was so close, the country's divided in two. These terrible communists, because he calls them communists, the Prodi people are communists, they control the parliament and the government. I should control the presidency. And therefore, my candidate is Gianni Letta. And Gianni Letta is an admirable man. Those of you who know him, he's really an absolutely outstanding person who is the right hand of Berlusconi. But the left, the center left, said, look, we won. We're not going to divide the powers that way. Well, then the latest offer of Berlusconi says, well, all right, if you don't take Letta, I want the present president to stay. Well, the present president, Ciampi, is admired by everybody, and he's been a very good president. But he's 85 years of age, and the term of office is 7 years. And everybody was waiting, and Mr. Prodi, very shrewdly, in response to Berlusconi, said, well, I'm not against that if President Ciampi is willing to do it. Well, we just heard this today that President Ciampi said, no, thank you very much. I mean, I think it's time for me to go. Well, then, there are two names that are being put forward by the center-left coalition. One is Massimo D'Alema, who is a former prime minister and who is the president of the Democrats of the Left, which is the largest element in the center-left coalition. But very tough for Berlusconi to swallow that. And not only Berlusconi, but a lot of Italians who have worries about the center-left and the influence even of former communists might say maybe not a good idea. So they go to the second name, and the second name, Mirabile Dictu, is none other than Giuliano Amato, a socialist, a constitutional lawyer, a graduate of our law faculty at Columbia Law School, former master of laws, so he can't be all bad. One of the great constitutional lawyers of Italy and indeed of the world. And if he is in fact, and I would hope and expect that that is the result, chosen to be president of Italy, it would be a good thing for Italy, and I think all of us who care about Italy would feel very good about that. This will happen on Monday, or if it takes several votes, on Tuesday. And then, certainly by the end of the next week, the new president will ask Prodi to form a government. Prodi will present his list of ministers, and we'll have a new government. And then we'll have to see how they govern. There are two people who are almost certain to be in the list of ministers, and I'll just mention them to give you a flavor of what can be expected. The Minister of Foreign Affairs probably will be Massimo D'Alema, since he won't be president of the country. I'm a bit prejudiced in his favor because my son-in-law, Ambassador Francesco Olivieri, who married my daughter Nina, partly as a result of our service in Italy, my son-in-law served Massimo as his diplomatic advisor when Massimo was prime minister, and speaks very well of him. He was a good friend of the United States in the difficult days of the Kosovo War, and was quite supportive of what was going on in those days. Of course, that was a different administration. It was Clinton. But I think he is someone that this administration will be able to work with if it works hard at it. And then the other key job is the man who will be head of the Treasury, the economic czar in effect, and that's going to be Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa. It's almost certain to be. And he is a man of great eminence. He's been on the executive board of the European Central Bank. He's been a Director General of the Central Bank of Italy. He's been head of the CONSOB, the securities, in effect like our SEC, securities, and the supervising of the stock market. And he's now a professor at Sciences Po in Paris, and someone that we could be very... I think the international capital markets would be very happy to see him in charge. But the hard question is, again, with this coalition, what kind of policies can they put through? All right, now just a word about the past, and I'll be very quick about this because I want to leave plenty of time for discussion. Why is Italy so difficult to govern? And that's a profound question, and I'm not smart enough to know the answer, quite honestly, but I'll just give some reasons that people mention. Well, first of all, Italy is a relatively new country. It doesn't have the sense, maybe, of nationhood that Spain does. Italy only became a country in the 1860s. And then for a while, the Vatican was against the new Italy and really ordered Catholics not even to take part in the elections. And then Italy, before then, of course, for centuries, had been governed by other countries, which engendered a deep suspicion of government in the average Italian. The Italians are kind of anarchists at heart, or at least many of them are. And if they haven't a loyalty, they have a loyalty to their city or their region. And this is known as campanalismo. The campanile, of course, is the bell tower. And therefore they're Venetians or they're Florentines or they're Sicilians more than they feel a loyalty to the country. And then Italy has been, as you know, deeply divided ideologically between right and left. Marxism-Leninism had a strong hold there, particularly after the collapse of fascism and Mussolini's government. The communists had derived benefit of being part of the opposition to fascism, and they came through as a major political force after World War II. And the dominant ideology in much of the university world when I was ambassador was Marxism-Leninism. And then the other pole, of course, is a non-Marxist, anti-communist, often church-led, but also liberals and secular folks. So there's a deep ideological split, a deep split geographically, of course, between North and South, and of course a split between the Catholics and the secular groups. So putting that together is hard. And Italians are, as I said, individualists and suspicious of government. And after World War II, they adopted an electoral law which has a strong element of proportional representation in it, unlike what we're used to, where somebody, my dear friend John Bradamus, who was in Congress for, 24 years, 20 years? 22. He had one district in South Bend, and if he won the majority or the plurality, he won. It's never been that way in Italy, and now they've even made things, it's always been proportional representation in some degree, and now they've gone back to 75% of the seats elected through a proportional system, which means that you have an area and you allocate the seats in proportion to the number of votes, which gives small parties a chance to be represented in a way that is not possible in the Anglo-American system. And that just aggravates, in my view, the problem of governability. After World War II, the big question was, who is going to govern Italy? Is it going to be the left or the right, or the center-right, led by the Christian Democrats, who emerged as the main party after the war? Communists were the second largest, the socialists were a poor third. And since most Italians were afraid of Italy being governed by the Communist Party. For 30 years, between World War II and the time I arrived in Italy as ambassador, Italy was governed by the Christian Democrats in shifting alliances with the socialists and small parties, the Republicans, liberals, social democrats. So the same people were in office. Amintri Fanfani had been prime minister 5 times by the time I arrived. Giulio Andreotti was prime minister 7 times before he retired. So a lot of people got sort of tired of seeing the same people in office. It was known as stable instability. Because the same people were in charge. It just moved around and the average government lasted a year. I saw 5 governments in the 4 years during which I was ambassador. That system led to a lot of inbreeding and corruption and clientelism, and people were increasingly discontent. But they were afraid to put the communists in power. Now, when Jimmy Carter was elected, we found that the American reputation in Italy, and I have to be a little brutal about this, but I don't think I exaggerate. My book tries to document it. Our reputation in Italy was very low because some of my predecessors, particularly one, Graham Martin, identified America's interest as doing anything to stop the communists, even helping some of the most disreputable neo-fascist and right-wing people. And a lot of money, CIA money, was put into the hands of a man named Vito Miceli, who was head of the Secret Services of Italy and then ran for parliament on the neo-fascist ticket. But in addition, Graham Martin's closest advisors were people like Paul Marcinkus, who had to resign because of his disgraceful way he ran the Vatican Bank, and Michele Sindona, who was put in jail for fraudulent financial activities, and a man named Pier Talenti, who was a Nixon fundraiser, who was charged by the Italian government with aiding and abetting a coup d'etat by Prince Valerio Borghese in 1970. He wasn't finally convicted, but he was asked to leave the country. So the image of the U.S. was not exactly the best. Jimmy Carter said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to play that kind of game. And in his inaugural address, he said something which, as I read these lines today, I get emotional about. Here's what he said, Jimmy Carter, much maligned Jimmy Carter, who I think history will judge more highly than many Americans judge him today. Carter said, "We will not behave in foreign places so as to violate our rules and standards here at home. For we know that this trust which our nation earns is essential to our strength." Maybe we should put those words into the Oval Office and have them read every morning. Because the soft power, to use that wonderful phrase of my friend Joe Nye at Harvard, that trust and respect and friendship and admiration which the U.S. used to enjoy in the world, if you don't have that, all the military power in the world is not going to give you a successful foreign policy. Now, Jimmy Carter didn't understand only soft power, although he also understood military power. And what he did in Italy was, he said, first of all, we're not going to deal with this extreme right-wing group. We're going to deal with centrist and center-left. The Socialist Party, which was off limits to my predecessors, became friendly. We got to know Bettino Craxi with all his faults. We felt it was important to encourage a democratic socialism. We allowed communists to have visas to go to the United States. I was authorized to open a dialogue with a number of communist leaders, including Giorgio Napolitano, who a very respected person who became a great friend. We allowed, not only allowed, we encouraged some of the great artists and writers and filmmakers of Italy, the Fellinis and the Wertmüllers and the Manzus and Shashas, to come to our residence, people who had been denied any access to the American embassy because they were considered leftists. Things went so far as that my immediate predecessor denied a visa to Italy's leading flautist, Severino Gazzelloni, because he played his flute at a communist rally at one point. He wasn't a communist. He wouldn't let him come to the United States. Well, we changed all that. Beyond that, Carter wanted to show the Italian people that our interest in them was not as a floating aircraft carrier of NATO bases and so on, but we cared about them and we wanted to help Italy deal with its major institutional problems and help it reform. And we launched a program called the Strategy of Cooperation, which I describe in my book, that covered a whole range of areas from education and energy to health, narcotics, crime, and investment in the Italian South. And I'm not going to say that this by itself changed everything, but I will say this. The Communist Party grew steadily from 19% to 34.4% before I came, and 8% of that increase was under Nixon and Ford. During our 4 years with Jimmy Carter, for the first time, the Communist Party lost votes. In 1979 election, they went down by 4%, and from then on, they never recovered. And that made it possible to deploy the cruise missiles in Italy, which Mikhail Gorbachev said in his memoirs was the turning point in the Cold War, because without Italy's participation, the Germans would not have accepted missiles, and these were the essential counterpart of NATO to the massive buildup of Brezhnev with the SS-20s. And that had a big effect in winning the Cold War. So much so that a Republican CIA director under President George Bush Sr. said some years ago in an all-too-rare tribute, I'm quoting here, I believe historians and political observers alike have failed to appreciate the importance of Jimmy Carter's contributions to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Well, my book tries to explain why Carter deserves that. I conclude very briefly with the problem of Italy's governability now. If you have D'Alema as foreign minister, as I think is likely, and if you have Padoa-Schioppa as treasury minister, you have two pillars of solidity. It then becomes necessary for Prodi to master some of these small parties, and particularly the refounded communists and Mr. Bertinotti. I've met Mr. Bertinotti. He does say some, from an American point of view, pretty terrible things. He wants to nationalize instead of denationalize. He's quite critical of the United States, sometimes perhaps with reason, sometimes I think without. I hope in his new institutional position as head of the House, that will help to moderate him. He's a man of responsibility. He now knows he's responsible as in this very important institutional position, and I have to believe that he is, at least for a while, going to cooperate in undertaking the kind of programs that Romano Prodi wants to undertake. But in terms of, and they are necessary. I mean, Italy has been losing competitiveness. Its share of its world market share has dropped from 4.8 to 3.8% because of rising wage costs. It's challenged by, obviously, China and India and Eastern Europe with low wage rates. The Made in Italy formula is hard to sustain, so much so that, Benetton used to have 90% of its products made in Italy. Now it's only making 30% in Italy because they've had to go to China and other places where labor costs are lower. Italy's debt is the highest in Europe, 106% of GDP. Its growth last year was 0, picking up a little bit now. But reforms are vitally important in the labor area and other areas and in the fiscal area. Foreign policy, it's going to take understanding on the part of both the center-left in Italy and the Bush administration if we're to maintain the good relations that are essential for the self-interest of Italy and the United States and the transatlantic relationship. I believe that if the Bush administration shows the kind of flexibility that Jimmy Carter did during the period in which I was privileged to serve him, and not be ideological, but willing to talk to people, even with a Marxist background, and listen to what they have to say, and realize that even center-leftists who have been communists can be supportive, as D'Alema was, of NATO interests, as they were in the Kosovo War. That if we handle this with intelligence, this relationship can be saved. At the same time, the center-left in Italy will have to recognize that even though they prefer, and they've made it very clear, the other America, and when they talk about the other America, they mean the America of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and Carter and Clinton. They turned out in great force in Boston for the Democratic Convention, these leaders of what is now going to be the center-left coalition. They're going to have to recognize that the America they're going to deal with for the next 2.5 years is George Bush. And whatever their preferences might be, it's in their interest to work with us. If that can be brought forward and made possible, we will have the kind of Italian-American relationship which is in the interest of the two countries and really a fundamental interest for the relation of the West. Thank you very much.
Please identify yourself when you recognize and remember. Questions ought to end up in an up note with a question mark and not be very long statements. The floor is yours.
So my wife's going to ask the first question. I was afraid of that. Okay.
What are Robbie's plans for troop withdrawal in Iraq? Is he going to pull a Zapatero?
Did you all hear the question? What are Prodi's plans for withdrawing the 3,000 Italian troops from Iraq? Will he pull a Zapatero? The reference is to the Prime Minister of Spain, who was elected 2 years ago, and very brusquely he pulled the troops out. Yes, the troops are coming out. I think the Italian troops are coming out. Well, now, that's the question. Berlusconi himself said that by the end of the year they would be out. And I think you can certainly figure that they're coming out by the end of the year. I'm hoping that Prodi will do this with a certain finesse and diplomacy, and just do a drawdown, a gradual drawdown. He's also made it clear, if you read his party platform, and this was accepted by his coalition partners, that even though they're going to take their troops out of Iraq, and that is a commitment they made, they're going to be very supportive of the NATO effort in Afghanistan, to which they do not object, because it was done by NATO, and they have no doubt that supporting Karzai and the effort to build democracy in Afghanistan is a worthy matter in the interest of the West. So they will be helpful there. They've also made it clear that they will help the Iraqi government, not with troops, but through democracy building and financial assistance. And they'll continue Italy's magnificent leadership in international peacekeeping. So I think that Americans should see that as a perfectly reasonable thing with which we can live. Sir.
Joel Rogers. I was wondering if there's any chance that with Bush and some of his more extreme advisors sort of in retreat, whether Condoleezza Rice might at least be reasonably acceptable and have a little better, more possibilities for reasonable foreign relations with Italy.
Well, I think Condoleezza Rice has brought a degree of moderation in the second term compared to what we saw in the first term. How far this is rhetoric and how far it is translated into practice one can argue about, but Condoleezza Rice has made, I think, a heroic effort right after she was chosen to go to Europe and be reassuring and listen. So that's positive. But the proof's in the pudding, and we're going to see what policy are we going to follow in Iraq, and then Iran is the big question looming over the horizon. Well, it's already with us. This could be another major test of the transatlantic relationship, how we handle Iran. And then you have other questions. If the Doha round collapses, we're going to have a very difficult period of finger-pointing. Who's responsible? The Europeans, because of their failure to give more on agriculture, the United States for our failure to, and that's going to be very ugly. So we have the transatlantic trade relationship at issue here. And then the war on poverty. I think this new government in Italy will be very committed to doing more on AIDS and on poverty in Africa and elsewhere. We'll want to see the U.S. leadership commensurate with our economic power, and so on across the board, relations with Putin, with China. But Iran is going to be the big, that's the big issue, and I have no idea. I don't think the pro-these people have not spoken out very clearly on what they think should be done about Iran. John Bradamus, yeah.
Dick, that was brilliant analysis. Thank you for it. To what extent does the Vatican play a significant role in Italian politics today?
Well, that's a very important question, and I've always been a professor who, when he's asked a question, is willing to say, I'm not sure. There's some things I don't know. Certainly, the Polish Pope devoted his main attention to things outside of Italy. And you can give him, as well as Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter, I think, credit for the overthrow of communism in Eastern Europe. But he didn't have that much to say about internal matters in Italy. What will this Pope do? Some people think he will be more of a presence in terms of the domestic scene. But that's going to be tough, because the center-left in power is going to push back very hard against what looks like Vatican interference in political and social policies. And Italy today, it's a Catholic country, but its policies on abortion and homosexuality and so on is pretty far evolved, maybe even further than we are. And by the way, you know what the birth rate in Italy is? Per couple, it's 1.3 children per couple, which is well below replacement rate fertility, so much that the Italian population, which is now 58.5 million, will be 50 million after a generation and a half. Which is another big problem, an aging population, and how do you support health care and Social Security? Who's going to do the work? So an attempt by the Pope to push his agenda, particularly the agenda which needs to be fairly conservative of this Pope, will exacerbate internal tensions in Italy. So I think he's going to be very cautious about it. But I just don't know. It's an interesting point, interesting question. Consul General, sir.
You have described Berlusconi striving to be perceived as America's best friend. To what extent do you think he succeeded? Did he manage to enhance Italy's status in the eyes of the American public opinion?
He certainly enhanced Italy's stature in the eyes of Republicans. And not so much in the eyes of Democrats. I'm giving you. That's because it became a very partisan thing. He was just uncritical and fully supportive of Iraq and everything that Bush was trying to do. He made Italy a very much more visible to Americans. There's no question about that. And he showed great flair and panache in bringing people to Italy for summit meetings, and on television bringing Putin over to see Bush, and giving the sense that Italy was playing a role in bringing people together. How much of that was show and how much was substance can be argued. But he did give Italy a role on the world stage. Yes, we can't deny that. And if you read the Financial Times and The Economist, it was not a role that at least the British respected very much, but it was a role. Prodi will have a hard act to follow in this regard. I should, by the way, there was a certain amount of success for Berlusconi in all this, because he got an invitation from Bush to come to Washington on the eve of the election campaign and be honored by addressing both houses of Congress, having a press conference with President Bush, in which Bush very openly endorsed Berlusconi's re-election. Said, I want him to be re-elected. Which seems, I think, if I'd been the ambassador, I would have said to the President, don't do that. We should not be doing that. in an election in a friendly allied country where both parties are in good faith, democratically oriented. I took a position against communists coming to power at the time I was in Italy because they were so obviously still, at least many of the Italian communists when I was there, were openly pro-Soviet and anti-American. So we thought it was not a good idea to have the Communist Party in power. But this group, these are social democrats and a miscellany of others who are leading. There is the problem of Mr. Bertinotti of the Rifondazione, but I don't see him as the kind of threat that the Italian Communist Party was at the time I was in Italy. In any case, it seemed counterproductive for the American president to have intervened in that way, and it didn't help Berlusconi. I think it might have actually been a negative. Yes, it was my professor friend here, and then the lady. Yeah.
Sarwar Kashmiri.
Yes.
I have two questions. One is, you hear a lot about the issues in integrating Muslims in European society.
Yes.
And I wonder if you can address that's also a factor in Italy. And secondly, can you conceive of any circumstance that will force Italy to drop out of the Eurozone?
Two, again, wonderful questions. There were 2.4 million immigrants in Italy. 400,000 illegals, by the way. And of the 2.4 million, a third are Muslim. This is a very small percentage compared to what the French face. But it's a source of great concern to the Italians, to the government because of the dangers of terrorism, and to the average Italian, I think, is not that happy with the presence of as many Islamics. We in the United States are much more comfortable with immigration. We're a country built on immigration. Italy has been historically a country of emigration. It was considered overpopulated and poor, and therefore it was comfortable with people leaving. It's much less comfortable with people coming. And there's a certain amount of hostility to foreigners, but particularly to Islamics. So that's an uncomfortable relationship, but and there'll be a battle. Immigration will be an issue in Italy as well as it is so much in our country right now. I think the center left will be somewhat more open to legal immigration than and asylum seekers than the Berlusconi government. But I'm not sure on that they may not be supported that much by the average Italian. The second question was on the euro. Again, I'm glad you asked that because it enables me to make a point that I didn't have time to make. Italy could compensate during the time I was ambassador and before and since for its inability to be competitive. Its high labor costs out of line with the rest of Europe, its huge fiscal debt and all that. It could compensate by repeated devaluations of the lira. They made a decision at the end of the last decade, as you know, which makes that impossible now. They took the courageous decision, it was Prodi who did it, when he was Prime Minister, to join the Eurozone. And the reason behind it was very clear, because until Italy did that, it would have to pay much higher interest on its debt and wouldn't be regarded as a safe place to invest and, wouldn't have credibility. And also, the Italians want to be part of Europe. After all, the Treaty of Rome was launched in Italy, and they're very proud of that. So, most Italians, I believe, still think it was right to go into the euro. And for Italy now to say, it's just too hard for us to maintain competitiveness. We can't control our labor movement. We can't make our labor market more flexible, hold down costs, increase R&D. We just can't do it. So we're going to have to devalue and we'll leave the euro. This would be a catastrophic decision. It will never be made with Prodi's approval, because after all, he was president of the European Commission. He said, unlike Berlusconi, who was Eurosceptic and had ministers calling for leaving the euro, Prodi and his people will not do that. So I think Italy will stay in the euro, but it does imply that they're going to have a much more rigorous economic policy than they've had so far. to become competitive. Yes.
My name is Vincencina Santoro. I'm an economist.
Yes.
And I used to be head of economic research for a major American bank in Italy for a while. I have two questions,
Yes.
if I may. The first, what do you see in the Prodi program insofar as dealing with some of Italy's outstanding economic problems? And number two, on the political side, how influential were American advisors from the Democratic side in helping Mr. Prodi and his campaign?
Well, the second part of your question is fascinating. I don't know. I don't know. It's quite possible.
I interrupted.
Do you know?
Just teasingly.
Yeah.
I sat next to Mr. Prodi at the NYU Law School a year ago, and when he was running the European Commission, and given my background, he told me that Cyprus is my biggest headache, and I told him, well, if you like, having been a politician in my country, if you want me to come back and manage your campaign, I'll be delighted.
Now, it may be. We have a lot of these campaign advisors who've been advising. Well, who's the one? I always forget his name. You know, who's been every unsuccessful Democratic campaign he's advised. Schrum.
He's on our faculty now.
Oh, right. Well, Mr. Schrum rents himself out to in between American elections to foreigners, and he may have advised Prodi, but he hasn't run a successful American election in a long time. I'm being a little cruel, but no, I just don't know the answer to that. But the economic issue, I can answer. If you look at the party platform, they published this. You've probably seen it in Italian. Exactly. The Benessere d'Italia, about 40 pages. A lot of fluff. I mean, it's very vague. They talk in terms of all the right objectives. We're going to we're going to increase research and development. We're going to make Italy more competitive. We're going to have a more flexible labor market. We're going to control fiscal things. But where's the dunque or whatever? Where's the meat? Where's the beef? Yeah. Now take one thing that I find very worrisome: the Biagi law. And again, I ask my Italian friends here, if I say this not quite right, they'll correct me. But Berlusconi did take some steps to liberalize the labor market. A similar thing to what the French are now having trouble over, having temporary contracts for young people so that a company doesn't feel that if it hires a young worker that they're stuck with him for 30 years. But you know what happened to poor Mr. Biagi, who recommended this law? He was shot. He was killed. Prodi, under pressure, I guess, from Bertinotti and his left, said he's going to change the law. He's going to amend that. Maybe not abrogate it totally, but, move it backwards. That's not reassuring. How's he going to deal with the problem of the fiscal deficit, which will be over 4%? 3%, as we all know, is the limit permitted in the Eurozone. Not always respected by the French and Germans, but the Italians are over 4% and rising, and the largest debt in Europe. So how's he going to deal with that? What's he going to cut? He says he wants to do a lot more with infrastructure, not to build the famous bridge over the Messina, connecting Sicily with. Some people think connecting Sicily by a bridge to Italy is a bad idea on its merits. But anyway, he won't do that. Berlusconi promised it, but he wants to do other infrastructure. He wants to do more to improve universities and so on. Where's the money coming from? He has to find an answer to that question.